Okay, let's just jump right into this explainer. Today we're unpacking a really complex, honestly pretty controversial legal theory from a source called Canada the Illusion. And we're going to impartially map out the exact arguments this source uses to claim that the nation of Canada, well, isn't at all what it seems. We're strictly looking at the historical documents, the legal definitions, and the specific timeline this theory pieces together to make its case. To wrap our heads around this dense theory, we'll go through 6 main sections. We've got the Grand Illusion, the 1867 deception, the emergence of sovereign provinces in 1931, the 1982 constitutional fraud, the concept of a person under maritime law, and finally, breaking the illusion. Section 1, the Grand Illusion, unpacking the core claim. So the source kicks things off with a massive foundational claim. It argues that the Canada we know, the land of endless opportunity, is actually a grand theatrical performance. It hits us with this highly provocative question right out of the gate. Could the entire nation actually be a corporation operating under maritime law, deceiving its citizens for over a century? The source basically asks us to lean into any underlying unease we might feel about the system, suggesting it comes from this massive hidden legal reality. So to see how they got to this startling conclusion, we really have to travel back in time. Which brings us to Section 2, the 1867 deception, redefining confederation. To build this case, the theory takes us all the way back to 1867 and the British North America Act, and it fundamentally changes the story of Canadian Confederation that most of us know. According to the source, this wasn't the birth of an independent nation at all. It was actually a carefully calculated sleight of hand. The creator claims Queen Victoria literally altered the BNA Act's preamble. And why would she do that? Well, the text points to the aftermath of the American Civil War. Great Britain had secretly built warships for the Confederacy, right? So, when the Union won, they demanded reparations, even threatening to annex British North America. The theory argues that to avoid a war and pay off this debt, Britain created this dominion to basically trick the colonists into paying U.S. Civil War reparations through taxes, all while letting the colonists believe they were finally self-governed. And as evidence for this, the argument points to the 1889 Interpretation Act. This act legally defined a dominion as, simply, a colony. According to the source, this means Canada absolutely did not become an independent nation in 1867. In fact, they point out the original BNA Act never even left the United Kingdom. It wasn't signed or ratified in Canada. So the Dominion was just a united colony still entirely subservient to British rule. The theory also makes a really crucial distinction here about who actually owned the land. It argues that the king or queen wasn't a true sovereign because they didn't actually hold the land titles. Instead, it claims a corporate entity called the Crown and Chancery. Basically, Britain's Department of Lands held the allodial titles. That means the true absolute ownership of the land. So the monarch was merely a figurehead, and the governor-general, appointed by this Crown and Chancery, held the real power as something called a corporation sole. Section 3, 1931. Sovereign provinces emerge. The Statute of Westminster. Okay, this brings us to what is really the linchpin of the entire theory, December 11th, 1931. If 1867 was the deception, 1931 is presented as the moment everything accidentally unraveled. The creator argues that the 1931 Statute of Westminster is the single most important document in the history of the Canadian landmass. Why? Because it legally changed that colonial status from 1867, creating a massive legal void that the source claims has never actually been lawfully filled. Specifically, the theory claims that Section 11 of the statute explicitly cut the connection between the Dominion and Great Britain. And since there's no legal middle ground between a colony and a sovereign state, the argument says this immediately ended the Dominion of Canada. And, totally unexpectedly, it elevated each individual province, like Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, straight up to the status of an independent sovereign state, meaning the land naturally reverted to the people of each province. Now here is where the theory drops its heaviest anchor. Because no individual province held a constitutional convention after this 1931 shift to establish a lawful government, the source argues that every single government law, tax, and prime minister since then is entirely illegitimate. According to this narrative, the system just quietly carried on as if nothing had changed, completely hiding this newfound provincial sovereignty from the public. All right, Section 4, the 1982 constitutional fraud, Trudeau's patriation. Building on that idea of illegitimacy, the source then looks at the 1982 Constitution Act. This is the famous patriation spearheaded by Pierre Elliott Trudeau, but the source calls it a grand theatrical deception. It meticulously lists out the very distinct legal steps that were strictly required to actually pass this act into law. It zeroes in on Section 59, which dealt with minority language educational rights in Quebec. According to the text, the Constitution could only come into force if a very specific sequence of proclamations happened, specifically requiring Quebec's authorization on those language rights. So, the narrative poses a really pivotal question. We have this complex legal checklist that the 1982 Act itself says must be completed to be valid, right? So, how many of these vital constitutional ratification steps actually happened in reality?
Well, the source concludes the answer is absolutely none of them. The famous 1982 Royal Proclamation, signed by the Queen, just stated that there would be a proclamation in the future, subject to Section 59. But because Quebec never authorized it, the creator asserts those final steps were never taken, meaning, supposedly, the Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms are legally null and void, just a complete illusion.
Moving on to Section 5, the person under maritime law, how the illusion operates. So, if the Constitution is an illusion and the government is illegitimate, you're probably wondering how the current system actually manages to operate and enforce its rules every single day. Well, this brings us into the realm of maritime law. The source asks us to stop and question a term we use all the time, a term that applies to you and me, the word person. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms says everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. But the theory suggests this legal definition is hiding a massive controlling secret.
Think about your driver's license or your passport for a second. Have you ever noticed your name is often printed in all capital letters? The source asserts that in legal terms, a person isn't a living, breathing man or woman. It's actually a legal fiction, basically a corporation created by the state. The theory claims the charter was designed to act exactly like a ship's charter, literally bringing maritime law onto the land. And by identifying as this person through our IDs, licenses, and passports, living citizens are tricked into submitting to corporate maritime jurisdiction. We're trading away our unalienable rights for mere corporate privileges.
And for evidence, the source points to something pretty wild: the 1985 Interpretations Act. This act literally defines Canada by its internal waters, territorial seas, airspace, and the subsoil below the waters, but it intentionally leaves out the word land. Why? Well, according to the theory, the corporate entity of Canada lost its access to the land way back in 1931 when the provinces became sovereign. So the corporation only has jurisdiction over the waters, the air, and those fictional persons it created. Crazy, right? Finally, Section 6, breaking the illusion, the source's proposed solution. So after laying out all this elaborate alternative history and this super complex legal framework, the creator doesn't just leave us hanging with the problem. They actually present a specific set of solutions for breaking free from this perceived corporate tyranny and reclaiming the land. First, they urge people to educate themselves and break their indoctrination. They highly recommend using the Socratic method, asking simple questions to awaken others rather than just lecturing them. Interestingly, they also urge people to stop waving the Canadian flag. They view it not as a symbol of freedom, but as the literal trademark of a corporation. Ultimately, the goal here is for the people of each province to get together, free of corporate lawyers, and hold new constitutional conventions to seat de jure, or legally authentic, lawful governments. And we'll leave you with the source's final provocative thoughts. According to this theory, you never change things by simply fighting the existing reality. To actually create change, you have to build a completely new model that makes the existing one completely obsolete. It really is a fascinating look at how historical documents can be so radically reinterpreted to challenge the very foundation of a nation's legitimacy. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and hey, keep asking questions.